This is where we should be right now in terms of our nutritional status. In the hour or so that has elapsed since we were last together, have any questions or comments or contributions arisen?
I had a question.
Yes, go for it.
So I was looking at the metabolism slides for reviewing, and I just wanted to double check about the phase 2 biotransformations.
Yes.
So I was just wondering, are those always considered conjugation, or
Yeah.
are there differences?
No, those are that's sort of considered to be synonymous, conjugation and phase 2. Now there might be some subtleties, but I'm not aware of them myself. So be confident yourselves that if you have linked the ideas of phase 2 or stage 2, sometimes they're called, in conjugation, you're right on track.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Keith, I also had a question.
Uh-huh.
When we were talking about elimination by the liver, you mentioned biliary secretion,
Yes.
and you said that it involved active transport, and it says 4 categories. And I was wondering what you were meaning with the 4 categories.
Those are just subtypes, and to be very straightforward with you, for the purposes of our exam, we're not going to go into detail like that. So
Sounds good. Thank you.
don't worry about it. You might, as a group, it's probably hard to trust somebody like myself in saying that don't worry about things and so on. But I think when you take the exam tomorrow, for the most part, you'll find that most of the questions are incredibly general. And there are a few exceptions to that, of course, but not too many. So some of the stuff, you'll bring your sense of humor with you, because some of the stuff you'll probably laugh at, that it's that straightforward. Any questions about the parasympathomimetics that we were just covering earlier today? When we get rolling, I'll have a little bit more to say about some of the direct acting agents, and then spend most of the time in canvassing the area, the tremendously versatile area of the indirect acting agents. Before we get there, though, let me do something pretty quick with current events. This is also out of a very recent issue of Chemical and Engineering News. And this is one that I caught my attention because I think there's a lot of perspective in this little article with respect to toxicity and the sorts of things that we've been talking about in a little bit more specific sense with respect to the PFAS and other substances. So this little article is entitled CNE News Talks with Baskut Tunkek, a UN human rights specialist on chemical hazards. He is a chemist and lawyer who has investigated the effects of workplace hazards and chemical pollution across the globe. So it starts in something that's pretty pertinent to our world right now. As worldwide shortages of protective equipment persist for healthcare staff caring for COVID-19 patients and others returning to work, calls continue for governments to do more to increase supplies to preserve the health of workers. One of those appeals comes from chemist and environmental attorney Baskut Tunkek, who works on behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Quoting him, "The brave doctors, nurses, emergency first responders, and other medical professionals, pharmacists, etc., working on the front lines of the global fight against the coronavirus pandemic are heroes," he says in one statement about COVID-19, the disease caused by the novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2. These people must be protected. More broadly, no worker is expendable. I think that's such a powerful statement. Every worker has the right to be protected from exposure to hazards in the workplace, including the coronaviruses. Among his concerns is inequitable distribution of personal protective equipment within and between countries, and he highlights developing countries as particularly vulnerable. And that is so apparent in the evening. International news coming from both the public broadcasting as well as BBC, they show situations that exist, across the globe. In many cases, refugee camps and so on, and it's just heartbreaking to see the stress on life and the loss of life that's occurring in those situations. He goes on to say that states and businesses should ensure that financial obstacles are removed and the supplies are provided at no cost for low-income countries. He is a special reporter on toxics and has an important mandate that associates a broad spectrum of human rights to a relatively specialized set of issues, says Richard Pearlhouse, head of crisis and environment at Amnesty International. Recently, Amnesty International itself criticized the US EPA's decision to suspend enforcement of routine environmental monitoring and reporting requirements if violations are caused by the pandemic. This expert has also called for countries to regulate chemicals by class rather than substance by substance. And that was the point, if you remember right, that those 3 New Hampshire residents were talking about it when we were talking about the PFAS the other day. If you try to regulate these things one step at a time in a class of chemicals in which there's 5,000 of those chemicals, you're going from here to eternity just trying to regulate the individual substances. He goes on to say, as problems exist when we phase out one chemical just to replace it with another, that may substantially lead to equal or greater concerns. We can see that happening with flame retardants and bisphenols. It is as if we are stuck on a treadmill. And that bisphenol topic is one that we'll probably talk about a little bit again when we cover toxicity here in another month or so. The bisphenols are kind of like the PFAS chemicals. They're ubiquitous. They're found all over the globe. They're used in a number of industrial processes, including the lining of canning vessels, be those vessels, tin cans or aluminum cans or whatever. There's this bisphenol coating on those insides that slowly leaches off into the fluid that's contained within the can. And so bisphenol A, BPA, was recognized some many years ago as being potentially harmful. And so there was some other chemical, I can't remember its moniker, that was substituted for bisphenol. So you could say, well, we don't cover the inside of the cans anymore with bisphenol, but it's covered with something. And this other something, I believe, if I remember correctly, was, as they talk about here, as toxic or more toxic ultimately than bisphenol was. So that was kind of a unfortunate sort of substitution that occurred there. This expert goes on to say that more action is needed to integrate the full consequences of chemical substances into risk assessments. Yeah, risk assessment, is a very sort of broad concept, and to integrate the various subcomponents of pluses and minuses is a big job, and one that's often not done. He says that getting better government and private sector interactions to act upon recommendations issued by the special reporter can be quite difficult, which I'm sure we can relate to when we think about the challenges that exist in terms of interfacing the scientific and the regulatory environments, as we have already talked about with respect to many of these things. Concludes with the following, and I've skipped a lot here just to save some time. For the reporter himself, helping to illuminate human-caused issues that may otherwise be underappreciated is important. Here's his final quote, and this is a really big one. I don't see any way around the problems we have created over the past several decades, but by taking a human rights-based approach. And as we talked about the other day, there are many of those issues out there. And once these sort of toxic substances are released into the environment, we've got them. And then it's a real challenge in figuring out how to relate to that next in terms of preserving the health of humans, other animals, and really entire life forms on our planet. Okay, so there's our little current event ditty. While we were going through that, did anybody come up? We had some good questions earlier. That's terrific. Any more questions, exam or otherwise? Exam or parasympathomimetics otherwise? Okay, well, let me skip forward here to that's kind of a soothing picture there. I don't know that you can see her or not, but probably not because it's pretty dark in here, but Black Cat is lying right off to the left side of me right now, just sound asleep, paying little attention to the meanderings of my vocalizations here. So let's go to this particular slide again on the direct-acting parasympathomimetics, or the direct-acting muscarinic agonist. And I want to draw your attention onto some. If you go into the textbooks and they list the compounds, and this is a nice category because it's a rather small, narrow one in many ways. And there's potentially a ton of compounds, but there's only a very few that are of significance as far as pharmacotherapeutics is concerned. So just about any textbook is going to list acetylcholine, methacholine, bethanechol, carbachol, and maybe pilocarpine in agents to pay attention to in this particular category. A couple of things that I would like to draw your attention to, and things that integrate us a little bit with pharmacokinetics and medicinal chemistry, is that the acetylcholine, methacholine, bethanechol, and carbachol are all esters, but only acetylcholine and methacholine are acetic acid esters, and bethanechol and carbachol are carbamic acid esters. That might not seem like much of a distinction, but it turns out to be in the particular sense that only the acetic acid esters, acetylcholine, methacholine, or similar sorts of compounds as that are readily hydrolyzed by acetylcholinesterase. And methacholine to a much lesser extent than acetylcholine. Acetylcholine fits in the binding site of acetylcholinesterase just tremendously well. There's been huge evolutionary advancements in that particular sense. You move away from that just a little bit to like the additional carbon that is found on methacholine compared to acetylcholine, and the ability of acetylcholinesterase to catalyze hydrolysis with that change dramatically drops. So, an important question to ask is whether these compounds can be hydrolyzed by acetylcholinesterase or not. And the carbamic acid esters, like bethanechol and carbachol, are almost not hydrolyzed at all by acetylcholinesterases. So there's a distinction there in a pharmacokinetic sense about metabolism of these compounds. Another thing to pay attention to is how muscarinic are these compounds? Are they muscarinic and nicotinic, or are they mostly muscarinic, or are they sort of almost completely muscarinic? And acetylcholine, of course, has prominent muscarinic and nicotinic actions. Methacholine, on the other hand, which we are using here as our prototype, is, again, with that one carbon addition, is almost completely muscarinic in its actions. It might have the very slightest edge of nicotinic actions, but not much. When you get to bothanicol, it is really almost completely muscarinic. And then carbachol is sort of on the fence. Once again, it's a little bit more like acetylcholine. It has both nicotinic and muscarinic actions. So anytime you're in a analysis of neurotransmitters and the drugs that mimic those neurotransmitters pharmacologically, you're asking questions about specificity. And in almost all cases, maybe not all, but all that I can think of right now, with particular neurotransmitters, there are multiple receptor subtypes that are targets of those particular neurotransmitters. And the ability of those substances in a informationally based sense, really, to distinguish between those various receptors is a very critical matter. It's become an even more critical matter in the last few decades of the development of pharmacological science, because aspects of specificity or non-specificity are associated with these sorts of distinctions. So it's really nice to have a fairly small category like the parasympathomimetics in which we can address that issue of specificity via the distinction between nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. And then another pharmacokinetic matter that we already talked about with respect to these compounds has to do with distribution, of course. And we already talked about the idea that, of course, the substances that have quaternary nitrogens with that formal charge are pretty much isolated outside the central nervous system once they've been administered. And it's only when you make a move into something like pilocarpine, which does not have a quaternary nitrogen, do you find that more systemic distribution of the compounds, and therefore a broader review of the actions. Now, this distinction between muscarinic and nicotinic, as far as cholinergic innervation and receptors is concerned, has significant impacts when we go to the indirect acting parasympathomimetics. Because the indirect acting agents, whether they're charged or not, and some of them are and some of them aren't, but they're going to have potential access to nicotinic receptors that supersedes what we find back in the direct acting category, because all synapses that are considered to be cholinergic have acetylcholinesterase, and therefore an indirect acting agent is going to impact the activity of acetylcholinesterase at muscarinic and at nicotinic sites, even in the periphery, even if we're not sort of bringing the central nervous system into the discussion at this point. So sort of if you, on this parasympathomimetics indirect acting slide, if you go 4 bullet points down, you can see where it talks about acetylcholine having both muscarinic and nicotinic actions. And if we inhibit acetylcholinesterase at muscarinic and nicotinic synaptic sites, then we're going to have a lot more nicotinic action than we see back in the direct acting agents. So the effects of indirect acting parasympathomimetics are kind of simple in one sense, in that we've already got part of it in our repertoire, in that we're going to get muscarinic effects that are very similar to the direct acting agents. But we're also going to get nicotinic actions. And to review a little bit about nicotinic sites that are found in the periphery, there's 2 major places where there are nicotinic sites in the periphery. And those sites are, of course, the autonomic ganglia, which we've already talked about, and the skeletal neuromuscular junction. Now, this morning we talked very briefly about 2 subtypes of nicotinic receptors. The N sub N, which are receptors at the ganglia, and the N sub M, which are nicotinic sites at skeletal muscle. Both of those sites, N sub N and N sub M, in the periphery, are going to be potential sites of action for the indirect acting agents. So in that sense, the indirect acting agent category is a more complicated one, because we have to think about additional sites of action at the ganglia and at the skeletal neuromuscular junction. Now remember that neurochemically at the ganglia are indistinguishable from each other relative to whether we're talking about parasympathetic or sympathetic. So the actions that are occurring in the ganglionic sense with respect to the indirect acting agents bring in not only cholinergic parasympathetic effects, but they bring in sympathetic effects because of the actions over there on sympathetic ganglia. So that significantly complicates the discussion. With respect to the skeletal neuromuscular junction, initial actions at the skeletal neuromuscular junction tend to increase activity there. And so the increased acetylcholine that's in those synapses following cholinesterase inhibition will cause a lot of tremor and shaking and tingling with respect to a skeletal muscle, which is, potentially aggravating, but not necessarily disabling. But eventually, those neuromuscular sites become paralyzed by having too much acetylcholine there, and we'll sort of talk about this a little bit more when maybe tomorrow afternoon. I'm not sure we'll get to it this afternoon. We talk about the skeletal neuromuscular junction a little bit more. So we've actually stepped outside the autonomic nervous system at that point. We can talk about the autonomic ganglia, of course, as being inside the autonomic nervous system, although not distinguishable because of the similarity of the ganglia between the subtypes. But when we go to the skeletal neuromuscular junction, we're no longer talking about autonomic effects. We're talking about peripheral but non-autonomic effects at that point. And you can get, in the most outrageous circumstances, you can get such substantial effects at the skeletal neuromuscular junction to cause paralysis of skeletal muscle. And that's particularly grievous when you think about supportive respiration, because of course the diaphragm and the intercostal skeletal muscles all have nicotinic muscarinic receptors associated with their activity. And then of course if we now make the transition to the central nervous system, and again, I won't talk about that much right now, but in terms of those agents, many of which can, in the indirect acting category, they're so lipid soluble that many of them can make it into the brain. You get kind of a double whammy as far as respiration is concerned, because you're already creating problems peripherally, but then you can paralyze the motor control centers in the brainstem and lead to paralysis of respiration at that particular point. So the indirect acting agents, which frequently are just labeled as acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, are remarkably active substances, both in the periphery and for those agents that can get to the brain, in the brain. So I thought we ought to talk about a little bit more of some of those distinctions, really in a pharmacokinetic sense, about where the agents can go, and then more in a pharmacodynamic sense when we talk about, well, are they impacting nicotinic, or are they impacting muscarinic receptors, or are they impacting both? Now, the indirect acting cholinesterase inhibitors are so generalized in their actions that you don't see much distinction between receptor, subtypes of receptors within a category like M1 through M5 or N sub M or N sub N. All of those sites are essentially impacted by the indirect acting agents because of the ubiquitous nature of the localization of acetylcholinesterase. Now, you'll notice on our parasympathomimetics indirect slide that as we go down to the second and third bullet points, that there's a distinction between reversible and so-called irreversible agents. Now, the reversible category is not a huge category, but it's a relatively important one for us because an agent like the prototype edrophonium is actually used, not much, but used a little bit clinically. So that's a important thing for us. On the irreversible side, you should probably put quotes around that irreversible, because in practice the agents are irreversible. Some of them may not be completely irreversible over an extended period of time, but it's almost a useless distinction to make about whether the agents are irreversible or a little bit or totally irreversible, because in the realm of toxicity, for the ones which can reverse a little bit in that category, you're probably dead already. Okay, so the time frames are of significance to us. In the irreversible category, most but not all of the agents are organophosphates. And you're probably most familiar with organophosphates from the realm of toxicology rather than pharmacology. Many of these agents are chemical warfare agents, and Katie, please jump in here anytime you want, or talk about it when you're with the class later on. I've listed two examples of irreversible agents, both of which are organophosphates. I list ecothiopate because it's actually used a little bit therapeutically, as is DFP, difluoroisopropyl phosphate. DFP is also used a little bit therapeutically, but is more renowned actually as a prominent organophosphate chemical warfare agent. Now, agents like tabin and sarin and soman and so on are examples of highly potent organophosphate chemical warfare agents. And a little bit can go a long, long ways. And that's why, in situations like the Tokyo subway bombing of a few years back, I think it was Solman, if I'm not mistaken, that was used there. The individuals, promoting the chemical attack can, bring in very small amounts of the substance, but they're so potent that it causes widespread effect. And so there's a lot more to talk about with respect to these things that we'll address here in a little bit. Katie, did you have a comment?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to comment. The Tokyo attack is a great example of organophosphate nerve agent exposure. Sarin has probably been more recently used in Syria. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons the Army was interested in kind of looking at therapeutics for sarin and organophosphate exposure. And then maybe the most recent would be the use of VX against the cousin of Kim Jong-un. And they had 2 people who actually attacked him, and he almost instantaneously passed away just again because of the high, because it's such a potent nerve agent. So those are just a couple more recent maybe exposures as well.
Thanks. That's great. It's really wonderful to have current examples like that, because really the more current, the more interesting things are. So once again, we are looking at a incredibly interesting category here, in that the agents are of interest to us in a very toxicological sense, as we've just talked about, or in a more therapeutic sense, which we'll talk about a little bit more perhaps tomorrow. But I would like to note, with respect to edrophonium on the reversible side and ecothiopate and DFB on the irreversible side, that the underlying things that are going on with respect to the active site of acetylcholinesterase are very relevant with respect to this distinction between reversible and irreversible. And let me go ahead one more slide to the next slide, which is titled Acetylcholinesterase Active Sites. There are multiple active sites in a given molecule of acetylcholinesterase, including what I've listed here as the so-called anionic site and the so-called esteratic site. There's actually more sites than that. There are some sort of additional sites which are involved in regulatory aspects of the enzyme. But for sort of standard understanding of what's going on at the active site, we can sort of stick to these two, the anionic site and the esteratic site. The edrophonium is capable of interacting at the anionic site. The anionic site is buried deep within a cavity of the active site of the enzyme, and the anionic, it's labeled that way because, and it's a little bit species dependent here, whether you're talking about a human or other species, but there's typically either a glutamic acid or an aspartic acid, which is able to interact in a charge sense with the quaternary nitrogen of edrophonium, or when you think about it, the quaternary site that's found in acetylcholine itself. So edrophonium does not extend its actions out to the esteratic site. It's only that charge thing that's going on at the anionic site. So that charge thing can be competitively altered, making a reversible interaction between edrophonium and that particular site. Let me also comment a little bit more on the anionic site, and that is The original postulation of the nature and naming of this site is anionic, has to do with those charge interactions that we've just been talking about. As the molecular basis of cholinesterase activity became better and better understood, it was soon recognized that the anionic site, almost paradoxically, not only has a very polar part of it, but has a very non-polar part of it. So that glutamic acid or acetic or aspartic acid is buried within a very hydrophobic portion of the catalytic gorge itself. And when you look back on it in sort of a retrospective sense, it kind of makes sense, because if you think about that quaternary nitrogen head group of acetylcholine, it's a quaternary nitrogen surrounded by 3 methyl groups. So there's, both a charge and a non-polar aspect to the head groups of acetylcholine itself. Katie, more comments? Do you have anything more at this point? Maybe not. Okay, go ahead.
No, please continue.
Okay. Now, a little distance from the anionic site is the so-called esteratic site. And in many ways, this is the real business site of acetylcholinesterase. Acetylcholinesterase is a member of the class of enzymes known as the serine hydrolases. And the serine hydrolases are amongst some of the most active enzymes known, with turnover numbers which are absolutely astronomical. And that's especially true of acetylcholinesterase. Acetylcholinesterase has one of the highest, if not the highest, turnover rates of any known enzyme. And what basically is going on there is that hydroxyl group of a serine residue at that site in acetylcholinesterase and its relatives is kind of acting like a super water. Just think about water as an HOH, and the OH hydroxyl part of it would be like what we have at the esteratic site of the enzyme. So that electron-rich oxygen at that site makes a very dramatic attack upon the electron-deficient carbonyl carbon site of acetylcholine. And in the number of steps that occur, and we won't worry right now, maybe we'll do a little bit more tomorrow, we won't worry right now about what some of those additional steps are. The ultimate consequence of the actions with respect to if we have, for example, an organophosphate agent interacting with that site, is the phosphorylation of that esteratic site of the enzyme. That phosphorylation is often a very, very irreversible sort of bond because of great stability between the phosphate and the oxygen, which basically takes the esteratic site out of action. The cholinesterase molecule now is so-called permanently inhibited because of that. Now, a parallel set of actions occurs with respect to just the interactions of the site with acetylcholine itself, except that in the case of the acetylation of the active site with acetylcholine, that can be rapidly reversed by water itself, whereas water almost can't reverse what's going on at the phosphorylated active site in the toxicological sense at all. All of these actions, acylation, acetylation, which is a subtype of that, or a phosphorylation, are similar sorts of events that are occurring, but with some widely differing consequences. So if we go back a slide, edrophonium can't do that stuff at the esteratic site, whereas agents like ecophthalate, DFP, sarin, and other organophosphates that we've talked about can. And so that nearly irreversible phosphorylation of cholinesterase active sites became a very active area of research emphasis following World War II. And in some of the most brilliant enzymology that I've ever seen, anyway, the chemical understanding of the active site of acetylcholinesterase led to ultimately therapeutic ramifications. And one of those ramifications is, if you go down to the next to last bullet point in this particular slide, you see the title oximes. Oximes is a group of chemicals, of which one of those, known as pralidoxime, is actually utilized as a therapeutic drug. And the ability of pralidoxime therapeutically is that it's so active site directed and so nucleophilic in its characteristics that it can reactivate so-called irreversibly phosphorylated sites. But it takes a super nucleophile like pralidoxime to do that. And to do it in a very specific sense requires a targeting of that structure to that particular site. And that's what enzymologists discovered even as early as the late 1950s or into the early 1960s. And I'll give you a little bit more history on that tomorrow. So in a technical sense, if you do it fast enough, you can reactivate those phosphorylated active sites of cholinesterase with a supernucleophile. Now, I mentioned do it fast enough because there's a temporal thing going on here. And phosphorylated active sites can so-called age over time. If those sites age, and that usually involves sort of the loss of a methyl or ethyl group or some carbohydrogen group from the structure of the organophosphate. If you lose one or more of those carbon-based sites in the phosphorylated situation, the enzyme is said to be aged, and it's done for if that happens. Even pralidoxime cannot reactivate that aged site. So that's why time is such an important matter in terms of getting the oxime to the phosphorylation site. So I see we're just about out of time for the day, and you folks have other things to do and plenty on your minds. So we'll stop with that, start up with more discussions about the active sites of cholinesterase, and then more about the general pharmacology of the indirect acting agents. I will see if anybody has any questions, or Katie, if you have more comments or anything like that as we wrap up for the day. All right, everyone. I hope the rest of your day goes well, and we'll see you tomorrow afternoon. First of all, at 1 o'clock for more lecture on the parasympathetic drugs. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Katie, I'll just hold on here for a minute. We can talk briefly when we're done here.
Sounds good.
The black cat just moaned at me. It's telling me to shut up.
How many cats do you have, Keith?
We have 2 left now. We had a 4 of them that were kind of a team, and we've unfortunately lost two of them either to old age or to predators around our living site.
Hmm.
So we have 2 right now. We have hip shot. We've seen a few times in slides, and then the black cat whose name is Olivia or Moxie. She goes by both of those names. So hip shot is kind of an aged fellow, and Olivia's pretty young. So we'd like to have more cats actually, but we're holding off for the time being because we've got a pretty stable situation with these 2 cats, and then we've got 1 dog anymore. We had multiple dogs at one time too, but we have one small dog now whose name is Jelly Bean, and I don't know if I've shown a picture of her yet or not, but I certainly will eventually. So Jelly Bean and the 2 cats get along really well. So we've got a trio of dogs and cats, and they're pretty well settled in. Hip shot, unfortunately, is very old, and
Hmm.
he's sort of hanging in there, but he's got some challenges to his health. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, okay, just a couple of things. One, I saw a note in the email. I haven't looked at it carefully yet. That we have 4 people at, and I think that's what you or Liz thought the other day, that we had 4. I was kind of thinking we have 5, and I'll look a little bit more along those lines. But apparently we have, according to DSS, we have 4 students who are utilizing their services tomorrow.